Hello, I'm Tommy D. Boudreau, and I chair the African American Heritage Committees with the Galveston Historical Foundation. We are here at Rosewood Cemetery because we know that we have some people here that need to be recognized and presented in a practical way, a good way. It's been a deserted area and neglected for years until it was donated to Galveston Historical Foundation. It was founded in 1911. A group of African American citizens met at Wesley Tabernacle and decided that they wanted to purchase land for a cemetery. Up until that time, it was difficult for them to find good burial sites, and even if they did, sometimes they couldn't afford them. So they were able to purchase this land from one of the Levy family members. In fact, if you have had an opportunity to look around, they own the land, this property, to the seawall as far as even 61st Street. After several of the members, passed on, the shares were passed to other people, and finally, all the shares were owned by Mr. Thomas T.D. Armstrong. When he passed, the family sold the land to a developer, and the developer, of course, he sold the land to various companies to build the motels that you see surrounding it. He donated the cemetery to Galveston Historical Foundation, and we are trying to preserve it, what little that we can. So I'd like to just share a little information on what we have left of some of the headstones. And to my left, these pile of bricks represent Sarah Chenal. Now, Sarah Chenal was born in Franklin, Tennessee. I have no idea when she came to Galveston, but she had 3 daughters and a son. She actually had her funeral home at Reedy Chapel. She lived, when she passed, she lived at 2913 H. It didn't indicate what type of work that she did, but Sarah was one who was born in 1846, and she died December 12, 1920. Another one I'd like to share with you is Ben L. Scott. Now, I think someone, maybe family members, have placed a new marker for him, because this one seems to be fairly new. Mr. Scott was born in Arkansas, and he's a World War I veteran, Private Company F. He was in camp at Camp Hill, Virginia, inducted into the service on March 8, 1918. His funeral was held at W.K. Hubert Funeral Parlor. Upon his death, he lived at 712 and a half 33rd Street. He was born April the 12th, 1886, and he died on February 21st, 1937. We want to recognize those people are here. We have people entombed here that were born in 1825, 1833, before Galveston was even founded. Some of them were not born in Galveston, but they perished here. A few of the people, sites, you can actually see their headstones and see their names. So over the years, once I realized that the cemetery was here, to be honest with you, I'm a BOI. I wasn't aware of this cemetery until year 2000. And I'll just tell you my age. I was born in 1942, so I wasn't aware of it until being with the committee people were talking about Rosewood Cemetery and how they had gone out and cleaned it up, but didn't realize that someone owned it. It wasn't the African American group anymore. So once it was, I realized I wanted to know more about the people here. And so I began to do a little research. I'm not a professional by any means, but I found some interesting things about a lot of them. For instance, we have veterans here. We have some that probably were in Galveston during the time of the 1900 storm and helped build Galveston. Especially those who came to Galveston or were born in the early 1800s.
My name is Rick Lewis. I am an assistant professor of practice of architecture at the University of Texas, San Antonio, where I have taught for some 20 years now, and have worked across many bounds in the state, in preservation and in documentation of historic structures. So once I returned to Texas after a career that took me many places in the country, and it took up my teaching career now of almost 20 years at the University of Texas at San Antonio. I made many reacquaintances with lifelong friends and colleagues, one of which was Dwayne Jones. Dwayne was hired in 2007, 2008, just before Hurricane Ike, to take on the directorship of the GHF. Dwayne and I had worked together at the Texas Historical Commission. So our friendship went way back into the 1980s. And so, Dwayne, I'm sorry I had to say that. Anyway, they went way back. But we reacquainted, and I said, eventually there's going to be some work I'd like to do over here with my preservation-oriented students, architecture students. He agreed wholeheartedly. He said, this is going to be great. So that began our relationship, again, that's been over 12 years now, of bringing students every summer. We've not missed a summer. This last summer, we did a project. We did projects. A colleague of mine did projects virtually for the island. So we always found work to do. The GHF has served a perfect host for this type of field school. A nice gesture, I thought, the students in working with the historians at the GHF, Jamie, thank you, was to list the names of those that had died on the island and that were interned with the date of their internment as part of the fly leaves of the inside sheets of the covers of the booklet. I thought that was you see here, I thought that was a really very interesting gesture graphically. Site identification and locating it here again on 63rd using aerial satellite referencing as to the part of the island. It is located off of seawall, and then particular to the street layout below. And then a nice graphic that gives us a 3D view of its location, again, at a distance from the seawall boulevard. And the hotel motel establishment along the frontage in that setting. The contours of the area are one of the greatest challenges because the cemetery is the low spot in an area that is where the land has been raised, which once was canaled and water could drain. Water was more easily drained from the site upon flooding events all the way back to 2014. But after the construction of the most recent motel, just adjacent here to the property, that channelization began cut off. And so the cemetery becomes a lake during rain incidents throughout the year. So the students wanted to understand that, recognizing that was going to be a major civil undertaking, civil engineering undertaking, to try to ever understand a way to drain this effectively. They decided to just say, well, it's going to be a lake at times, but the island's soils are such that water percolates really quickly, and then it's not a lake anymore, and just accept it again for what it is, and not be so terrified of that. So these again are some more details of the topography and recognition of how deep it is off of the street itself. 63rd also serves almost as a dam by the way it was constructed, and as a cut-through passage to the motels as they were being developed. A couple of photographic images of the poor condition of the site as the students found it. The site is maintained nicely, has been mowed now for years under contract by the GHF. So it's always kept, but I think landscape architects would see it with the palms that have come up volunteer and other plant material, but mainly just cut and cared for as a very uncultivated landscape, a very simplistic thing with the markers identifiable certainly when the grass is being mowed. A few other photographs starting to include some of the context of the buildings around it. Early sketches allowed the students to identify and start to think about the site. And this led then to the frontage that is where we put most of our effort. Within the immediate right-of-way to Broadway Street, the introduction of an elongated boardwalk that would parallel the street and get walkers out of the street, an extension of the sidewalk beyond that all the way to 63rd, which is beyond the scope of our study, but we made recommendations as such. And then some shading devices that would occur periodically along the path, and at the rail, the potential for some interpretive markers to describe what people are seeing. We blew that plan up, you can see from the graphic above, and we detailed it sectionally through a fold-out sheet of the drawing, so we could start to understand the boardwalk and its railings, the shading canopies, and then some important landscaping that we wanted to introduce along the street. A pattern of palms that would stand high, almost as landscape sentinels looking over the cemetery, and give the path a little identity as you would look at it, principally viewing it from seawall. The palms were going to be an important introduction of the landscape. So here we are back at the site again in total. So a few elevations and sections. This would be the street of 63rd. So you get a sense then of the path. This section taken in an area that's particularly narrow, and the path, as was described, it undulates. It's an angular formed freestanding feature on pilings or piers of concrete built of treated wood and lumber. But at points will reach and touch the curb line of 63rd, and at other places it pulls away from it. So it really does get the feel of being a boardwalk or a dock, something that's a very familiar part of the landscape of Galveston, and the sunshade devices that would be constructed of combinations of metal and wood. Now, this is going to give you the sense of a view of that looking from across the cemetery. Sectionally, again, you see the hand railings and the piers, the shading devices. A motel is lightly indicated in the background, and the memorial at the extreme end where you would enter the path. These standing objects that we'll portray in just a second. Okay, it's the first rendering, and there are the memorial objects that I've just described. We envision those as a stainless steel with names etched on them, some description and interpretive information here with a subtle logo that would be created for the cemetery, and an understanding of what this is, and then the names as well as they are known of those that have been interned here in history past. Then you would enter the boardwalk and make your way the length of the cemetery. There is at a mid-junction, a place where you can go down. There's a ramp that allows people that do want to go down and walk the cemetery grounds. It allows the public to do that. But we didn't make it a real obvious thing because it's not going to be encouraged. It's once you get down there, it's still a very difficult terrain to negotiate. And there's concern on the part, I think, of GHF, citizenry, the city, that this not be turned into a place where people could hurt themselves, kids staying at the motel, play soccer, anything else. So it's not going to be an invited type of thing. We want to try to maintain a real reverence about the place. And at the far end, there is an access where mowers and service vehicles are given leeway down the embankment to continue to serve the grounds. This is a nice view. Gives you a sense of the ramp that's coming down to the ground, the boardwalk, and then the motels in the distance. You get a nice feel here for the green fence that we think will really be important. That kind of fence doesn't come cheap. It's going to be a really important feature, and I hope that the funding, as it has gained momentum, will make sure that that's an important element. I think it's critical to distinguish the cemetery as it is and to give it more dignity. Looking towards the west, the memorial placards, an aerial view with the shading devices where you could pause and sit. And then the architectural and construction material short list, very condensed short list. But this, within the document, it goes into describing how these things would in fact be built. The materials, the likelihood of their care and maintenance being a positive thing, because the building of such infrastructure isn't going to be something you can do frequently for a place that's had so little investment in its history. We know that this project is going to be, let's call it a one-time thing. And so the students were quite understanding of what that would entail. And of course, that would be trying to use fine quality products. Stainless steel, I mentioned in the memorial placards a while ago. And then having artisan work to properly etch those, and then to root and anchor those in concrete sufficiently beneath the boardwalk. And every detail that connects all the wood and timber to support the wood decking on top, the handrails. These things under the climate that exists in Galveston and being subjected to salt spray, it makes for a very difficult environment to protect things, all the way to the lighting fixtures have to be best quality to be able to be sustained, not only from vandalism, but most importantly from the elements. So I told the students, it's like an academic project. We're going to worry about the budget another day. And we're going to restrain ourselves in what we're doing architecturally. This thing is going to be smart, clean, some people would call minimal. But that doesn't mean it isn't going to be dignified, and certainly doesn't mean that it's going to be cheap. We're going to spend the money in the right place to do what little we do very well, so it'll survive well into the future. And people will find this a place of pride, and no longer a place that no one understands. So I thought they did a real good job of research. I assisted them with my background professionally in developing the criteria for the actual construction. So here we highlight some of those details to aid the GHF and others as they would naturally pick up a student project and take it to the next level, which of course I think is where we are as funds have been raised. But to be able to prioritize then where the monies could best be spent to kick this off. And so we wanted to create some documentation of the way you could do that. It begins, of course, with rudimentary studies of details. This is a little plan section. that starts to consider, this is looking down onto the structural frame, and how you would anchor the upright post for the handrails. So that becomes really important. How do we just took a section of this and we started to discuss, well, how do the piers work and what connects them and what kind of frame members will we use? Treated timber and then treated dimensional lumber with appropriate treated metal connections. Here's a section of that kind of incorporation of pier with metal fittings and rails that come up between sections of the boardwalk. And these details help depict those, inclusive of how the memorials would likewise be anchored on footings and then peak up and slots that would be allowed for them to come up through the boardwalk itself. The shading structures, we developed a series of, this again is a roof plan detail, how these would be constructed of tubular steel, treated tubular steel members and welded with metal sheet capping that and finishing it. This is kind of a real quick sketch contrivance of the way it would actually be built. And then some detailing again of the way the rails would be finished with this beveled component at the top of the rails periodically, where you could put insert placards or imagery that could describe what you want to see. That's what that looks like once we do a digital rendering of how that would work. This detail again is how all this comes about structurally. We conclude the project again without a lot of fanfare. This document, like many we've created in working with the GHF and other organizations and nonprofits around the state and country, are really best used as a catalyst. They allow young minds without a lot of constraint to look in their own way, in their own time, and how you address, in this case for architecture students, a very difficult project. But it's a document I think is very respectful in the way it was undertaken, the findings and the proposals. We provide these then to our host, and in this case, the Galveston Historical Foundation, to take and build on this, to write grants, to seek out funding, to gain the kind of enthusiasm from leadership in the community, but also the supporters, and especially supporters that have been there for the long run in the Black community, that received this extremely well. We made a formal presentation in the summer of 2019, and we had invited guests, and it went over extremely well. And so I'm real proud of the work that students did. So we've left it there. We have returned, and we're eager to continue to help. At this point, the handoff will naturally go to licensed contractors, people that will be able to exercise the appropriate skills and management to build such a boardwalk with the shading devices. An architect is probably going to need to be hired to oversee and transition the schematic work that the students did to ensure that it's all detailed, that an engineer makes sure that the shading structures don't fly away in the next hurricane. And so there will be a lot of necessary detailing to be undertaken. But we think that this project is very close to being launched for the reality of its construction. And that's what I have to offer. Will, I've appreciated the invitation to return to this. It was wonderful to bring it out of my database. It isn't something I've forgotten, and I know the students that worked on it haven't forgotten it. They've moved on in their lives, they've graduated, but I know that they would have this experience, and to great benefit. That's part of what these projects are about, is that these students, these four architecture students, are going to be better prepared to undertake the kinds of very unusual projects that will come at them in their careers. So this also proves a great academic benefit as well, but I know they're never going to forget it And I know that they'll be looking forward, as I will one day, returning to Galveston and to Rosewood Cemetery, and perhaps seeing something very akin to what was proposed, constructed there. I know everybody has long awaited this, so I encourage an ongoing dialogue and the action yet to come. So thank you for taking the time to hear me out.